All right. Well, good evening, folks, and welcome back to Too Many Cards and Dice. My name is Ben, and I am the host of this channel. Tonight, we're doing another deck tech for a commander deck here for Magic the Gathering. This is one of my older decks, as might be suggested by the comparatively dark sleeves. These are not Dragon Shields. I'm not sure who they are, but they're cheap. Regardless, tonight's deck is Phenax, God of Deception. For 3 blue-black, you get a legendary enchantment creature who's a god. He's indestructible, and as long as your devotion to blue and black is less than 7, he is not a creature. And what he does when he's in play, creatures I control have tap. Target player mills X cards, where X is the creature's toughness. So, when I built this deck, my main goal was to just fill it with creatures with Defender, because they tend to have big butts anyhow. But then I tried to lean in a little bit with the deception side, with cards that involve illusion and changing things. And then I realized that in the end, this is a mill deck. And frankly, folks, if you play Commander long enough, you end up tinkering with some type of mill deck. So this one is mine. Now, Phenax has a particular creature from the dark called Eater of the Dead. I have no idea how to fix the light. Maybe one day I'll be professional enough to have that sorted. But tonight you get blurry pixels. I don't know how to fix it. Anyhow, Eater the Dead costs black 4. And for 0 mana, you take 1 creature from any graveyard and remove it from the game to untap Eater of the Dead. He's a 3/4. And so you are tapping him with Phenax in play to mill 4 off 1 player. And in theory, you can run through somebody's deck if you are fortunate enough to hit at least 1 creature each time, and they have put enough creatures in their deck to ensure that you hit one at least once each time. The reality from my experience is that you can dig deep into somebody, but then you inevitably run out of creatures to eat. So there you have it. Slagworm Armor. This equipment costs 1 to cast and 3 to equip, and it gives target creature +0/+6. Outside of Phenax, I don't know that there's any deck that you would want to put this in. I mean, despite the casting and equip costs. I mean, who needs toughness? Oh, I guess Doran needs toughness. And maybe whichever dragon animates all the walls. But aside from them, very few decks need Slagworm Armor. But it makes the Phenax decks even dumber. Next up, we have a handful of cards that untap all non-land permanents you control. First up is Dramatic Reversal. It is an instant for blue 1. And ideally, you are sticking this on Isochron Scepter. But when I built the deck, I was going for a more budget version. I've had a bit of wine. Apologies. And at the time, at least, Isochron Scepter was more than I was willing to invest in this deck. So, but Dramatic Reversal, untap your whole team, tap them all again, mill a whole bunch. Freed from the Real is an aura that lets you tap or untap as long as you have blue mana. In this black-blue deck, it does not go infinite. But you can typically really ruin somebody's day depending on the creature you slap this on. Breaking Wave. It's a sorcery for blue 2. You can make it an instant if you pay 2 more. But basically, you untap all tapped creatures and tap all untapped creatures. So, um, potentially you set people up to be attacked by someone else while you are ensuring that you can mill more people or at least have an ample amount of blockers to not die. Turnabout, another instant for blue blue 2. Tap or untap all artifacts, creatures, or lands target player controls. These could be your creatures, which is typically how I use it, but in a pinch, you can really mess up somebody's day with an instant speed turnabout. And this has been reprinted several times, so you can find it. Intellectual Offering is another instant for blue 4. Me and one opponent each draw 3 cards, which is lovely, but the reason it's in here is the second part. Untap all non-land permanents I control and all non-land permanents that player controls. So whoever is, and these can be different opponents. Just be aware with these offering cards, they can be different opponents. Sudden Spoiling. This is more of a pet card than anything else. If I am building a black deck, I really work hard to jam Sudden Spoiling in there because it's an instant for black 1. Split Second is hugely useful. There's some corner cases where it can still be interacted with, but for the most part, it cannot be. So therefore, you turn somebody's entire army into a bunch of 0/2s with no abilities. Now, in this particular deck, you are probably not going to kill them in response because you're running a bunch of walls, basically. In other decks, that is ridiculously useful. Anyhow, Polymorphist's Jest. This is a blue version of Sudden Spoiling. Each creature target player controls loses all abilities and becomes a blue frog. That is a 1/1. Memory Plunder. This is a mill deck at heart. So what Memory Plunder lets you do, aside from running a cool art card in your deck, you may play target instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost, which can be incredibly useful depending on what you fetch out of whomever's graveyard. Because this particular mill deck, while it doesn't play too much in graveyards, it does not go out of its way to exile them. So you have options, but then again, if your opponents are running decks that play in the graveyard, all you are really doing is hooking them up. Whatever, you get to play stuff out of their yard. All right, which leads us to some removal. Tragic Slip. I love this card. Typically, I only play it when Morbid is available, and then it just kills things outright. Arcane Denial. I know people will complain about this counterspell. Oh, my opponent gets to draw cards. I really don't care. Yes, they do. There's better things for 2 mana, but at the time, this is what I had. This is what I jammed in there. If nothing else, I get a card. In a pinch, I can counter my own spell, and I get 3 cards. But that is desperation at its peak, so I probably will never actually do that. Negate. Counter target non-creature spell. Self-explanatory. Memory Lapse. This plays very, very nice with mill decks. I counter the spell and I put it on top of a library, and then I mill. All right, some more standard removal here. Go for the Throat. Destroy target non-artifact creature. Murder. Destroy target creature. If I were to revamp this deck, I would probably replace this with Champion's Downfall or whatever. The one that costs the same and is an instant and hits a creature or planeswalker. All right, Sorcery for 5. Black 3. Sometimes this card is a dud. Other times it will spin the table on its head, especially the exile all tokens part. But given the prevalence of +1/+1 counter decks and planeswalker decks and all the other bizarro counters that more recent sets have been providing, this can be hugely useful. So I'm keeping it. All right, No Mercy. Because yes, I am old enough to have opened multiple No Mercies from packs back in the day. And I'm pretty certain I was stationed in Korea at the time. So there you have it. Anyhow, I threw No Mercy in here because yeah, you'll hit me, yeah, you'll deal damage, and then yeah, you'll die. All right, some more generic mill cards that if you are running a mill deck, you should probably consider, if not just add wholeheartedly. The first one here is Mesmeric Orb. It's an artifact for 2. And like all orbs and spheres in this game, it is an artifact and it ruins people's days. So, whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller puts the top card of their library into his or her graveyard. And really, what destroys people is when they've tapped a whole bunch of lands and artifacts that are not treasures to cast things, to play the game of Magic the Gathering. Excuse me. And then when their turn comes around, boom, they mill a whole bunch because of this stupid orb. Mind Grind, Black Blue X. This card can ruin somebody's day, and on the off chance you are playing the Horde variant, where the Horde does not use land at all, this is an instant win. Anyhow, each opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they reveal X land cards. Then they put all cards revealed that way into their graveyard. X cannot be 0. What I have learned through experience is that if you can make X as big as possible, at least 4, 5, or 6, but bigger is always better, you can eat entire decks in many cases. Yes, it depends on the stage of the game. Yes, it depends on how well the player shuffled or did not shuffle, as well as their deck composition. But man, you can ruin people with this card. And given that some casual players will scoop when their pet cards get milled, I mean, really, it just wins games. All right, Fractured Sanity. When this was spoiled, I was so excited. Sorcery, blue, blue, blue. Each opponent mills 14 cards. You can, in fact, cycle it, and then you draw a card, and each opponent mills 4. But I don't ever foresee that actually happening, at least not when I am piloting this deck. This is in here to zap each of y'all for 14. Startled Awake. All right, a flip card. Such is life. And with these sleeves, you can actually, if the lighting is right, you can kind of tell the difference. Under the camera here, you cannot, except, no, you really can't. But with some sleeves, you can. Anyhow, starts off life as a sorcery. Target opponent mills 13. Once this hangs out in your graveyard, it flips. And it becomes a Persistent Nightmare, which is a 1/1 with Skulk. And when it deals combat damage to a player, return it to its owner's hand. So basically, I mill you, I pop you for 1, I mill you the following turn is how that works out. The real trick is remembering to put it back as Startled Awake at the end of the game. All right, Extract from Darkness. It's not much, but each player puts the top 2 cards of their library, they mill 2, to include yourself. And then you get to pick creatures out of anybody's graveyard. And it doesn't matter if they just landed or if they've been there since the beginning. This can swing games, but does not help with a milling win. It typically helps with a I'm removing an option for you by killing you dead. All right, Psychic Spiral, instant for blue 4. Shuffle all cards from your graveyard into your library. Target player puts that many cards from the top of, they mill that many. And given that many of the cards in this deck mill you as well as your opponents, you are typically nailing somebody for even more. Maddening Cacophony, a sorcery for blue 1 that you can kick for blue 4 for a grand total of you can kick for blue 3 for a grand total of blue 4. Each opponent mills 8. If you kick it, each opponent mills half their library. Folks, if you are running a mill deck and you are not including this, you need to revise your deck list. All right. But of course, there's also just basic draw. If I can't draw cards, I can't do things. So I've got Preordain, because I found a whole bunch of them in a bulk box for 10 cents each. So I'm jamming this in every blue deck I own. And if you ask nice, I might be interested in sending you one. All right, Brainstorm. Instant, draw 3, put 2 back from your hand. It can save the day, or it can just stall your plans for 2 turns. So it really depends on when you play it and what you're looking for. Personally, I love it, but other players not so much. Ristic Study. That's right, folks. I was old enough to open these out of packs when they were commons. And overall, the whole Ristic thing, charging your opponents mana, sucks. But this card has survived and is now rare and is money. But I've got several of the original printings. So I have one in here because drawing cards is never a bad thing in Magic the Gathering. Speaking of which, read the runes. Scry 2, draw 2, lose 2 life. All right, sign me up. This should probably be in every black deck. Next up, I have a handful of snow cards because I also wanted to use this deck to make use of a handful of snow lands that I owned. So I went out of my way to build a deck around snow lands, even though it doesn't need them too much. And to kick things off, we've got Merit Lage's Slumber, and a legendary snow enchantment for blue 1. When it or another snow permanent, like my lands, enters the battlefield, I scry 1. At the beginning of my upkeep, if I control 10 or more snow permanents, I sack this, and then I get Merit Lage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. It's like the land that you sack. All right. I've also included Graven Lore because, I mean, it's a pretty neat card for blue 3. It's expensive, but it's a snow instant. Scry X, where X is the amount of snow spent to cast a spell, then draw 3 cards. Ideally, this deck is spending 5 snow to cast a spell. At the end of your turn, of course. Read the Bones. Black 4 snow sorcery. I can either remove all creatures or remove all planeswalkers. And then I get something back. Where X is the amount of snow mana to cast a spell. So ideally, I should get something that costs 6 or less. Be it a creature or planeswalker, and put it into play. And this deck in particular, there are only 2 permanents, both creatures, both primordials, that cost more than 6. We're going to talk about them in a moment. So, if nothing else, I can pull stuff out of my graveyard. Next up, we have the creatures. All right, as I said at the introduction, the whole point of this deck was to do something with all my defenders, my walls. So we kick things off with the steel wall. I pay 1, I get 4. In theory, you mill 4. Wall of Runes. Again, 1 for 4. And I scry 1 when it hits play. Wall of Mist. I pay 2, for 5. Wall of Tears, I pay 2 for 4, and it bounces whatever it blocks. This can backfire in a very spectacular fashion, and I'm good with that. Some players may not be. Wall of Souls. Whatever it blocks, that damage is dealt to target opponent. Not necessarily the person who attacked me with the creature. So I'm not saying you can use politics with this card. Attack me with your big guy, friend, and then we'll hit the other guy and put him out of the game. But you totally could, and maybe you totally should. Wall of Air, I like this art, and for blue, blue 1, you get a flying wall for 5. Wall of Frost is 0/7, and whatever it blocks doesn't untap the next turn. Monastery Flock, I don't care about morph. I care about flying, especially a 0/5 for 3 mana. All right, Drift of Phantasms, I'm torn. Yes, it's a 0/5 flyer, but you can search out all sorts of 3-drops in this deck. I don't have anything in particular that I would go seek out at this time, except maybe another Defender. All right, Wall of Bone. He's a 1/4 regenerator, and he's made of bone. And this art, I would argue, is the best of the lot. Wall of Wonder. This is not the best wall out there, but it is beautiful artwork. Look at that. Especially with the black border, because this is from Legends. Yeah, you pay blue, blue 2. You can animate it and make it a 4/1. Sorry, a 5/1 instead of a 1/4. But look at that art with the weird art. There's Stuffy Doll from Black Vice and the Rack and Cursed Doll. I mean, this is just a fun card to run, even if in the end it's not all that great. Another card that is just beautiful is this Beta Living Wall. I think since I've slapped it into the sleeves, it's taken some damage, especially up here. It might be shuffling related. Nah, I don't care. It looks very pretty. It is a 0/6 regenerator with Defender. So, I tap it for lots, or I regenerate, and you got, to me, really cool art set off by the old border and then the black border. Beautiful, beautiful card. Amaranthine Wall also costs 4, also a 0/6, and I can make it indestructible for the low, low cost of 2. Tree of Perdition. Exchange target opponent's life total with Tree of Perdition's toughness. As you might imagine, the point of this card is to trade life totals with somebody with something substantially more than 13. And then at the first possible opportunity, tap and mill probably that person for whatever their life total had been. Drift of the Dead, another snow card, and honestly the main reason I wanted to run snow lands in this deck. His power and toughness are equal to the number of snow-covered lands you control. Now granted, in a typical Commander game, I won't have more than 8 to 10 lands in play, probably closer to 6 to 8. But still, just think of it. And the art itself is meh. All right, Colossus of Akros. Costs 8, Defender 10/10. And if I pay 10, I can turn him into a 20/20 Trampler that does not have Defender. So, in a pinch, should this card land, I can just have him punch people in the head, kind of shift gears entirely, leaving mill, going for damage. Horseshoe Crab, also not a wall, but I can pay to untap him as long as I have blue. And again, there's no infinite mana in this deck, so I'm not going to get much more. But I can get a couple of reuses out of this guy. Relic Golem. He's a 6/6 for 3. I don't care that he cannot attack or block. Well, maybe the block part. Unless an opponent already has 8 or more cards. But he can make a person mill. King Makar, the Gold Cursed. 3 ain't much in the grand scheme of things. But whenever I untap him, I exile target creature. And then it is replaced with a token that is basically treasure that enters play untapped. It's a gold token. I think that's pretty neat. My dream is to put Freed from the Real on this guy. Or in theory, Pemenzora, but that's not in this deck, so that ain't going to happen. Either way, he doubles as very slow removal. Silent Arbiter, a 1/5 who limits all attacks and blocking to 1 creature each time. The Go Tall decks don't care. The Voltron decks don't care. People relying on hordes of creatures, probably, but not always, tokens, will be sad. So it doubles as a defensive card that I tap at the end of your turn to mill you for 5. Cherix, the Raging Isle. Blue 2 for a 0/17. Basically, he has Ward 2. And in theory, I can make him deal damage and reduce his toughness based on how many islands I control, but I would never do that. A 0/17 blocker that I can tap to mill you for his toughness, which is 17. Or 23 if he's got Slag Worm armor on, and I mean that's like a quarter of your deck. You can make people scoop when they lose that many cards in one go. Anyhow, another snow card, because I reached a point where I'm like, I'm all snowlands. I should run more snow cards. Hailstorm Valkyrie, black and 3, flying trample, and I could pump her up with snow mana. Here's the thing. When I'm pumping her up, I mean, with this deck, I just want to like tap her and mill you more. So in the end, this is an excellent example of a card that can go away, because really it exists to deal damage, not so much to tap and mill. I don't know. I'm torn, but it's pretty neat art, and it's a Valkyrie. Morphling. Yes, I'm also that old. I know I opened this in Korea. Anyhow, you can untap this as long as you have blue mana and keep eating people for 3 or more. So in theory, you can use your swamps to make its toughness bigger and then keep untapping it. But you can do other things with it as well. Morphling used to be like a key card in winning games for control decks. Consuming Aberration, another card that all mill decks, if they don't already have it, I would imagine they want to jam into themselves, because its power and toughness is equal to the number of cards in all opponents' graveyards. Ugh. And whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, and then they put those cards into their graveyard. In the end, this supports milling, but really it exists to block well, and in this deck, mill well, but to punch people in the face. The biggest difficulty in play is keeping up with how many cards and just how big it is, especially late game when all 3 players are in play and scores are in the 70s, 80s, or higher. And then you're looking at, well, who do I remove? And then you got to do a bunch of subtraction. Whatever, it is well worth it. If you're playing mill, add this guy. All right. Sire of Stagnation, Black Blue 4, Devoid, it doesn't matter. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, they exile the top 2 cards of his or her library, and you draw 2 cards. This card can go. Honestly, this is in here more for the draw than the exile. If I ever rebuild Sirku, Dimir Lobotomist, this is definitely coming out, so it can go in there. But it's fun, and you can really frustrate people, and you can tap him to mill 7. Oops. All right. I mentioned these guys earlier. Sepulchral Primordial. All right. You're paying 7 for both these clowns. And this one has Intimidate. He's a 5/4. But the important part is when he hits play, you go through each opponent's graveyard, and you get to pick 1 creature from each graveyard. And they are now yours and in play, and you get their delicious enter the battlefield effects. Choose well, choose wisely. If you can change Sepulchral Primordials, that might be the dream. But even if you cannot, it's a great card, but it costs 7. And it only taps for 4, whatever. Diluvian Primordial, very similar, another 5/5. This one flies. But you go through the opponent's graveyards for instants and sorceries. Or sorceries, and you get 1 from each graveyard. All right. There is, and I acknowledge this, a paucity of rocks and ramp in this deck. Although, from experience, it works out with everything else. Anyhow, it contains Yield Soul Ring, because why not? It also contains Commander Sphere, because when I built this deck, this was a great card. Not so much anymore, especially because what the deck really, really wants is Dimir Signet and wants Arcane Signet. And I don't have any, so there you have it. Commander Sphere. Oh, and the whatever the talisman is. So we jump straight to lands, folks. There are 36 lands in this deck. One of the non-basics is this snow land, Scrying Sheets. If you are running a snow deck, add Scrying Sheets. Gives you a colorless, or you can use it as a weird form of, I guess, pseudo draw. I mean, you're tapping 2 mana, you look at the top card of the library, if it's snow, and in this deck, that means it's probably a land. You reveal it and put it in your hand. If you lean heavily into snow, this can be a whole lot better. But in my case, I occasionally nab a land. Oh, wait. Ooh. There is a mana rock for 2 that is a snow. No, there's at least 2 mana rocks that are snow mana rocks. I need to look into that for the next revision because, as you might imagine, I haven't revised this since building it many years back. Anyhow, Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse are fairly self-explanatory because they get snow lands just as well as normal lands. Drowned Catacombs. Ooh, M11. I'm willing to bet that's about the time frame I built this deck. Anyhow, it's your very basic land there. Frostmarsh. Enters play tapped. Snowland. Gives me black or blue. Ice Tunnel. Snowland. Enters tapped. Gives me black or blue. Thank you, Kaldheim. Bajukabog. Enters play tapped. Exiles a graveyard. Now, it doesn't matter what deck I put this in. I never seem to draw it unless it's within the first 3 turns. and then I am in dire need of land. And then the graveyards I exile typically have 0 or 1 card in them. But maybe your luck will be better, and in theory, this deck's luck will be better. So I keep it, even though it never works out for me personally. All right, then I got a bunch of snow-covered islands and swamps. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 snow-covered swamps of various art. I would really love to get all Cold Snap, but it is what it is. There's probably 15 snow-covered islands, but let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I was close. And again, I'd love to get the Cold Snap ones, but until that time happens, I'm good with what I currently have. So there you have it, folks. A Phenax deck who mills, but if he dies, and he will, the deck does a whole lot of nothing. Now, that said, I know we do not sideboard in Commander, but there's always cards that we're like, should I add it? Should I leave it out? I don't know. And I have a handful of those. First up, we have Thought Collapse. It is a counterspell that forces somebody to mill 3. On the surface, it fits right in with what I'm doing. So maybe it'll show up. Sphinx's Tutelage. Whenever I draw a card, target opponent mills 2. And then, if those cards share a color, I mill them again. And then at any point, I can pay 6 to draw a card, then discard a card. I would never pay 6, but that's a nice neutral effect going on. Psychic Corrosion. Whenever I draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library in their graveyard. Again, it only hits one opponent. But you and I both know that when you sit down and shuffle up at a table, there's one opponent, probably based on the commander they chose, who is public enemy number 1. So you hit them first. Court of Cunning. I'm really on the fence with this card because not much of my stuff actually attacks. So this lands, I hand out the Monarch. I bring Monarch into the game, and then people mill. If I lose Monarch, I'm probably not ever going to get it back. And then effectively I've paid 2 to let somebody else, 3 to let somebody else draw a card while I mill everyone for 2. I don't know that it's worth it. All right, Bond of Insight. This is another card that I'm torn. I can make everybody mill or just some people. And then I pull stuff out of my graveyard. So this may make the cut in the 99. I don't know. Now, this falls under Phenax being the god of deception. Illusionist's Gambit. And it's got that extra caveat. Yeah, it's an instant, but only on declare blockers on an opponent's turn. Basically, it lets you redirect attackers. And honestly, you can redirect somebody else's attackers, which is good because this deck owns none. The drawback is that this deck, since it owns no attackers, you are 100% relying on your opponents to swing big for you to redirect with this card. Blight Pile. It loves Defender, and each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of creatures with Defender I control, which is many. But the game being the game, it will probably only be 3 or 4 each round, which has nothing to do with mill, so it'll probably never make the cut. This one, though, for 3, it's a 0/6 that lets me surveil. I really don't like discarding. I understand the logic. So even if I don't use the ability, it's still a 0/6. It's a lot. Shield Wall Sentinel lets me go fetch up a defender when he enters the battlefield. That's actually can be really useful, even if all my defenders are doing is having big butts. All right, then a bunch of snow-covered lands. All right, so there you have it, folks. Phenax, God of Deception, the way I run it. If you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to add them in the comments. Like and subscribe. You know the drill at this point of the game. I am always on the lookout for cards to improve this deck. This is one of the few that I have never taken apart since building, unlike pretty much all of my other decks. So this deck will happily accept recommendations, and yes, I know I need to heavily revamp the land count or the non-basic lands used, as well as the rocks involved. So aside from that, engage down in the comments, and thank you very much for watching.